The sky over western Germany looked no different that morning. Thin clouds, pale sunlight, the steady hum of engines cutting through thin air. For a German fighter pilot, this was familiar ground, another day of intercepting American bombers that dared to cross into the Reich. Experience suggested the outcome was already written. The bombers would come in, the escorts would turn back, and the hunters would finish the job. But on August 17th, 1943, something subtle had changed. An American fighter appeared where it was never supposed to be. Not over Belgium, not near the coast, but deep enough to kill a seasoned German ace who had survived years of combat. That single encounter did more than end a life. It exposed a flaw at the heart of Germany's air defense doctrine, a flaw no amount of courage or skill could repair. At the center of that realization stood Adolf Galland, the man responsible for Germany's fighter force. While others celebrated a costly victory over American bombers, Galland saw only wreckage, and in that wreckage, a warning. Small, easily overlooked. 2 metal fuel tanks mounted beneath an American fighter's wings. Those tanks meant range, and range meant control of the skies. The question was no longer whether bombers could reach Germany. It was whether Germany could survive once enemy fighters could stay with them all the way. Long before American bombers darkened the skies over Germany, Adolf Galland had already learned a lesson that would haunt the Luftwaffe for the rest of the war. It was not learned in Berlin conference rooms or from intelligence reports. It was learned in the cockpit, watching fuel gauges sink while enemy fighters waited patiently above their own homeland. Galland's understanding of air warfare was forged early. As a young pilot in the Spanish Civil War, he flew low-level ground attack missions, where aircraft and pilots were consumed at an unforgiving rate. Survival depended not on ideology, but on preparation, coordination, and logistics. Air combat, he learned, was a brutal equation. Ignore the numbers, and you died. That equation revealed itself most clearly during the Battle of Britain. From airfields in northern France, German Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters escorted bombers across the English Channel. On paper, the aircraft was excellent. Fast, agile, deadly in skilled hands, but it carried a fatal weakness: range. Every minute spent over England was borrowed time. Fuel constraints forced German escorts to turn back just as British Spitfires and Hurricanes, operating over their own territory, were reaching peak effectiveness. The British could choose when to fight. They climbed, waited, and attacked at the moment German bombers were most exposed. The Luftwaffe did not lose because its pilots lacked courage or skill. It lost because its fighters could not stay. Galland understood this immediately. When Hermann Göring asked fighter pilots what they needed to win the battle, Galland's answer shocked everyone in the room. He did not ask for medals or praise. He asked for Spitfires. Not as an insult, but as a diagnosis. The enemy aircraft could remain over the battlefield longer. That single fact outweighed all others. By 1941, Galland's combat record and reputation propelled him into high command. At just 29 years old, he became General of Fighter Pilots, responsible for every Luftwaffe fighter unit across Europe. The promotion should have given him the authority to fix the problems he had already identified. Instead, it trapped him inside a system unwilling to listen. German air strategy remained fixated on bombers. Göring believed wars were won by striking enemy cities and factories, not by defending one's own skies. Fighters, in his view, were tools of convenience, not decisive instruments. Defense of the Reich was secondary. Galland saw the danger immediately. Across the Atlantic, American industry was awakening. The United States was building aircraft in numbers Germany could not match. When the 8th Air Force arrived in England, it brought a doctrine shaped by optimism and steel. American planners believed the B-17 Flying Fortress, bristling with machine guns and flying in tight combat boxes, could defend itself in daylight. Escort fighters were considered unnecessary. The bombers would fight their way through. To Galland, this belief was both wrong and temporary. He knew bombers alone could be defeated. He also knew that once the Americans solved the problem of fighter range, everything would change. The fate of the air war would hinge not on bravery, but on who adapted first. By early 1943, the stage was set. The Reich prepared to defend itself against a growing storm, confident in doctrines shaped by past victories. Galland watched the skies and waited, knowing that one technical breakthrough would decide everything. By 1943, the American daylight bombing campaign had reached its most dangerous phase. The 8th Air Force believed it had found a way to break Germany's industrial heart without paying an unacceptable price. The answer, American planners thought, was mass and firepower. Tight formations of B-17, Flying fortresses, bristling with machine guns, would create interlocking fields of fire strong enough to repel any fighter attack. On paper, the theory was elegant. In reality, it was incomplete. German fighter pilots adapted quickly. They learned that attacking from the side or rear meant flying into a storm of defensive fire. Instead, they came head-on. At closing speeds approaching 600 miles per hour, American gunners had only seconds to aim. Heavy 20mm and 30mm cannons tore into bomber noses and cockpits. Unguided rockets exploded among the formations, shattering cohesion and leaving isolated aircraft helpless. Most importantly, German pilots learned patience. They waited until American escort fighters reached the limits of their fuel and turned back toward England. Then they attacked in waves, climbing, diving, firing, disengaging, landing to rearm and returning again. It was a system built on repetition and attrition, and in the summer of 1943 it worked. The cost to the Americans was staggering. On August 1, 1943, Operation Tidal Wave sent B-24 Liberators at low altitude against the oil refineries at Ploiești. The mission achieved tactical surprise but paid for it in blood. More than 50 bombers were destroyed, and over 500 airmen were killed or captured in a single day. The lesson was clear. Bravery alone did not make daylight bombing survivable. 2 weeks later came the mission that defined the air war's turning point. On August 17, 376 B-17 seconds launched a double strike against Regensburg and Schweinfurt. The plan relied on timing. Fog destroyed the schedule. The gap between formations allowed German fighters to refuel, rearm, and attack again. Over Germany, the Luftwaffe unleashed more than 300 fighters. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs tore through the bomber streams. Rockets detonated. Bombers fell burning from the sky. 60 American aircraft were destroyed. Hundreds of airmen were lost. From a tactical perspective, it was a triumph. German leadership celebrated. Hermann Göring declared the battle a great victory. Propaganda proclaimed that American daylight bombing had been broken. But Adolf Galland did not share the triumph. As reports filtered in, one detail refused to leave his mind. American fighters had been present far deeper than expected. They should not have been there. The accepted calculation said it was impossible. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. 2 months later, on October 14, 1943 Black Thursday, the Americans returned to Schweinfurt. Nearly 300 B-17 seconds pressed on despite heavy losses. German fighters inflicted devastation once again. 60 bombers were destroyed. Hundreds more were damaged. It was the bloodiest day in the history of the 8th Air Force. To most of Germany's leadership, it proved they were right. To Galland, it proved the opposite. The Americans had not stopped because they were defeated. They had paused to adapt. And Galland knew that when they returned, the old tactics would no longer work. In the weeks following Black Thursday, the German High Command believed it had won a decisive victory. American bomber losses were unsustainable. Crews were shaken. Missions were suspended. On the surface, the Luftwaffe appeared to have regained control of the skies over the Reich. Adolf Galland saw something very different. While others focused on bomber wreckage, Galland focused on the fighters. In October 1943, German recovery teams examined the remains of American aircraft that had crashed near Germany's western border. These were not bombers that had drifted eastward after damage. They were fighters P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings found deep inside German territory. This should not have been possible. Galland personally inspected the wreckage and immediately understood what had changed. Beneath the wings were external fuel tanks, drop tanks. Simple, inexpensive, and transformative. With them, American fighters could escort bombers far beyond the limits imposed by internal fuel alone. The entire German air defense system, built on the assumption that bombers would eventually fly unescorted, had just lost its foundation. Galland moved quickly. He gathered photographs, maps, and technical assessments and brought them to Hermann Göring. His message was blunt. If American fighters could reach the German border today, they would reach Berlin tomorrow. German interceptors would no longer face isolated bomber streams, but bombers protected by aggressive fighter screens. The tactics that had worked so well would become suicidal. Galland demanded action. Fighter production had to increase dramatically. Pilot training programs had to be expanded. Resources had to be pulled from offensive bombing and redirected toward the defense of the Reich. Time, he warned, was running out. Göring dismissed him. The Reichsmarschall declared Galland's conclusions defeatist speculation. He insisted that American fighters had not crossed into German airspace and forbade further discussion of the matter. The wreckage, he claimed, had merely glided east after being damaged elsewhere. Reality itself was denied. Within days, the consequences of that denial became unbearable. On August 18, 1943, Hans Jeschonek, the Luftwaffe's chief of staff and one of the architects of German air strategy, took his own life. He had overseen years of bomber-focused doctrine and knew perhaps better than anyone how exposed Germany had become. His suicide sent shockwaves through the officer corps, though the truth was officially concealed. For Galland, the personal cost was devastating. On August 17th, he had lost his brother Wilhelm Ferdinand, killed by an American fighter that should never have been able to reach him. Less than a year earlier, his youngest brother Paul had also been killed in combat. The war was no longer an abstraction. It was a ledger of names. Still, Galland did not stop. He continued to submit reports and warnings. He argued that the American pause after October 1943 was not surrender but preparation. The enemy was rearming, retraining, and refining doctrine. When they returned, he warned, they would come with fighters capable of staying for the entire battle. Germany had been given time, months to prepare, months to adapt. Those months were wasted. While German leadership clung to old assumptions, the United States was quietly rewriting the rules of air warfare. The pause in deep penetration raids after October 1943 was not an admission of failure. It was a recalibration. American planners had learned the same lesson Adolf Galland already understood. Bombers alone could not win control of the skies. In January 1944, that lesson was translated into doctrine. General James Doolittle assumed command of the 8th Air Force and immediately changed the mission of American fighters. Escort pilots were no longer chained to bomber formations. Their new task was explicit and ruthless: seek out the Luftwaffe and destroy it wherever it could be found. In the air, on the ground, during takeoff and landing, the bombers were no longer the center of gravity. German fighters were. This shift coincided with the arrival of the P-51 Mustang in large numbers. Powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and equipped with drop tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back. It could climb, turn, and fight on equal or superior terms with any German piston engine fighter. For the first time, American air power combined range, performance, and numbers. The results were immediate and devastating. In February 1944, the Allies launched Operation Argument, known as Big Week. For 6 days, waves of bombers struck German aircraft factories while swarms of Mustangs and Thunderbolts hunted interceptors. German pilots rose to fight with determination, but the old tactics no longer worked. Fighters that broke off attacks were pursued and shot down. Airfields were strafed. Experienced squadron leaders were killed in numbers Germany could not replace. The air war had shifted from defense to annihilation. By March 1944, American fighters were appearing over Berlin in daylight. The psychological impact was profound. German civilians had been assured the Luftwaffe would protect the Reich. Now they could see contrails overhead and watch German fighters fall in flames. The promise of protection had collapsed. For the Allied High Command, air superiority was no longer theoretical. It was operational reality. When planners prepared for the Normandy invasion, they did so with confidence that the Luftwaffe could not interfere in decisive strength. On June 6, 1944, Allied aircraft filled the skies over France, while German fighters appeared only sporadically. The invasion succeeded not just because of men and ships, but because the air war had already been won. From Washington to London, the conclusion was unmistakable. Long-range escort fighters had changed the fate of nations. Industrial capacity, training pipelines, and adaptive doctrine, not individual heroism, had decided the struggle for the skies. By the spring of 1944, everything Adolf Galland had warned about had come true. American fighters roamed freely over Germany. The Luftwaffe was losing pilots faster than it could train them. Fuel shortages grounded entire units. Airfields became death traps, bombed and strafed daily by enemy aircraft that faced little opposition. Control of the skies, the foundation of modern warfare, had slipped away. Galland continued to fight, even as the system around him collapsed. He placed his last hope in the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Faster than anything the Allies possessed, it offered a glimpse of what might have been possible if Germany had acted sooner. But delays, mismanagement, and Hitler's insistence on using it as a bomber robbed the aircraft of its potential. When Galland finally led a jet fighter unit into combat in 1945, it was too late to change the outcome. Germany surrendered in May 1945. Its cities lay in ruins. Its air force, once feared across Europe, was shattered beyond recovery. Galland survived the war. He was interrogated, studied, and eventually respected by his former enemies. British and American pilots who had fought against him recognized something rare: an officer who had understood the war as it truly was, not as ideology demanded it to be. In his post-war life, Galland wrote, advised, and reflected. His memoir was not a celebration of victory, but a record of failure, foresight, and ignored warnings. Even Hermann Göring, confronted with defeat and stripped of power, ultimately admitted the truth. The Luftwaffe had lost because American long-range escort fighters made deep penetration bombing possible. Without them, the air offensive would have failed. It was the very conclusion Galland had reached months earlier. Standing over the wreckage of a crashed American fighter and studying 2 discarded fuel tanks. The lesson remains as relevant today as it was in 1943. Air superiority is not won by individual aces or isolated battles. It is won by industry, training, logistics, and the willingness to adapt before it is too late. Technology changes the character of war quietly at first. Those who recognize it early may survive. Those who deny it will not. Galland saw the future in broken metal on German soil. He tried to warn his country. History proved him right. If this story made you reflect on how wars are truly decided, share your thoughts in the comments. What moment of technological change do you believe altered history forever? And if you value these deeper examinations of military history, consider subscribing. The battles may be over, but their lessons are still being written.